So, I mean, just to start you off with a sort of softball question, what have the last 2 years done in terms of changing our country and changing our politics, do you think? What are the takeaways from COVID?
Well, two, I would say. The first is the spotlight that has again been shone on the inequalities in our country. It's undeniable what it reveals, isn't it? The map. If you look at the case rate, the death rate from COVID across the country, I'm afraid you will see a massive north-south divide. The impact on the north of COVID has been just huge. The human impact, but also the knock-on impact, the impact on young people missing school. This is why I was on the streets of Manchester this time last year saying you don't realise what's going on here, because people were being hit really hard. And it's not just the north. You can find those places all around the country. And if you go back to the 20th century, the 19th century, the 18th, these are the same places in England that have always had the highest levels of deprivation. But the pandemic has absolutely put a brutal spotlight on that again, and it's completely clear. So that's one thing that's been revealed in the last 2 years, but it's kind of been revealed again. It's kind of what we knew, but it's been put in sharp relief. The second thing is the Whitehall and Westminster system. It's created that inequality, and it's incapable of changing it. If you look through the pandemic, all the worst traits of the way that system works, and I know it well, were on show. They were running it as almost an election campaign at the very beginning. It was about the PR of the pandemic, and the decisions were wrong. They outsourced and privatized when they should have localized when it comes to test and trace. That sort of dismissing of local government. As I say, the North was not, what was going on in the North was not fully understood in that SW1A, OAA bubble. And that's what it's revealed, both the scale of the inequality in the country and how the system that we've got of government, it isn't not just unable to solve it, it actually creates it and it exacerbates it. And that's why fundamental change is needed. Britain needs to be completely rewired, in my view, if you're to create the conditions for levelling up.
Just on that second point, is it, just to be clear, are you saying it's a function of politics, i.e. the nature of the government we have in power at the moment, or of power? That is to say, the fact, whoever's in power, if all the power is centralised in London, it's not going to work? Yeah,
I think, it's not just this government. You can go back even through the Labour government, any government. In this system that we have, I've always said it, but there's London centricity. That is inevitable in a system where you have all political power effectively vested in one place. That place where that power is vested will benefit more. But if you think about it, the civil service, largely London-based, what they're putting forward to Parliament generally gets rubber stamped by the Commons. And then you have a House of Lords where the vast majority of people in the House of Lords have their primary residence within the M25. I mean, it's not surprising that there will be a London bias in the system, because the whole place is kind of geared, it's kind of set up that way. And so, Lord Kerslake has said this in his UK 2070 Commission. He said it really plainly, and this is a former head of the UK Civil Service. Britain is simultaneously one of, if not the most politically over-centralised country in the OECD, and the most regionally unbalanced. And those two things are connected. Political over-centralisation and regional inequality, those two things are, there's a causal relationship between those two things. So it's why I come back to the point. If you really are serious about levelling up, radical change is needed, not a few little pots of money and this, that and the other. You radically need to rewire the country.
I have to say, I've long thought that one of the reasons we get fuel crises is because it takes people in London a while to realise that some people drive to work. So
well, that's a good point.
Slight sort of...
How many people do you think in the Cabinet, or indeed in Parliament generally, know what the cost of a single bus fare in Manchester is compared to one in London? They probably know what one in London is, but I bet you they've no real idea what it costs to use public transport outside of London. And that's why it's an issue that never gets any airtime. It never gets any sort of oxygen, that issue. But I'm trying to raise it repeatedly, because that is the kind of issue that Labour needs to really focus on. Why shouldn't all of the country have London-level fares, £1.55 for a single bus journey? Why not? Why do we have to pay over £4 for a single bus journey? Yeah, exactly. I mean, thank you. That is exactly the reaction you often get from people who are, I'm not having a go at London and saying it's a great transport system, but why aren't we entitled to say we want the same? Why are the poorest parts of the country the places that have the highest costs when it comes to public transport? I mean, why? And it's time to get more outspoken on these things. If, we're not being patted on the head with this levelling up thing from anyone in Parliament, to be honest. If you're serious about it, get serious about it. If you're not, then don't even promise these things to people, because that will only fuel the alienation that is already there in large parts of the north to the Westminster system.
I mean, I'm biased, but I wouldn't pay £4 to go to Manchester. But anyway, I'm going. So the other side of the equation, we've done the sort of general thing, but the other side of the equation is the Labour Party. The last time the Labour Party met here was in 2019. Is the party in a better position to govern this country now than it was then?
Yes, I think so. But it's got a lot of work to do. A lot of work to do. I think, I understand, because I've been there, and I got frustrated myself, if I'm honest, in the shadow cabinet between 2010 and 2015, when I was trying to push a reform of social care that I felt and still feel is desperately needed. And social care on NHS terms. The Labour Party used to stand for that. No other arguments. That is what we should be calling for in the 21st century, with all of the challenges of ageing. We should be saying our big idea that was the NHS, that we are now going to extend it to cover all care. That is just a Labour policy for the 21st century. And I remember, though, the argument saying, oh, well, set it out nearer the election. Don't put. I just don't think the world works like that anymore. If the government comes forward and puts an unfair social care policy on the table, which they did a couple of weeks ago, your criticism of it won't be heard unless you say, and here's what we will do. I just think that's how it works now. The age of social media people have to say, you can't just criticise. You have to say, I wouldn't do that, but I would do that. And I think the party needs to start thinking in that way. You can't set a policy out on everything, I understand that. But on the big things that are the issues that are, levelling up, social care, all these things, you have to set out your stall. And I hope, we're going to, and I say this as wanting to see everyone, Keir and all the shadow cabinet succeed. I think you have to start setting out your stall if you're to get people to start listening and engaging.
I mean, you've talked about the need for Labour to speak less to itself, but isn't there a danger that you become part of that problem? I mean, your interviews yesterday were sort of all over media. And you said some interesting things yesterday. One of the things you said was, I'm more of an independent voice, which struck me as curious, because you're a Labour Party member and a friend to the party. I mean, it sounded from your language that you were sort of putting yourself slightly on the outside.
Well, if I'm honest with you, I think devolution has been put slightly on the outside by the Labour Party, and I don't think it's got its relationship right yet with the new devolved entities across England. I'm not going to labour this point, but I'm just going to say it now, and then I'm going to sort of deal with the issue. We've got 5 mayors in the north of England, and the north of England is a big issue for the Labour Party, isn't it? We've got to win hearts and minds back there, otherwise that Scotland effect could carry on moving south. And the mayors are a fantastic opportunity to first woman metro mayor, the great city of Leeds, But why do none of those, I'm not asking for myself, by the way, here, but why does none of those northern mayors have a platform speech? I'm just asking that question, because that is the kind of thing that isn't yet right. There's no real recognition yet of mayors within the part. All of the debate about electoral college, we're not, we only represent 2.8 million people in Greater Manchester. But we're not even a player in that kind of. I just think that we've kind of been pushed a little outside of the. The party hasn't yet decided what it's really doing about English devolution, and it needs to decide. And I would say it's got to wholeheartedly embrace it, because it allows for a completely new way of doing politics that engages people better. And I think the results in Liverpool showed that, Tracy's result showed that, my result showed that. This is a bit of a life raft for the Labour Party in the north of England, and it needs to be grabbed, not sort of left to its own devices. And I'll keep saying that, even if the interviews are challenging or awkward for some, that is a question. Labour has been too London-centric. I keep saying it, and I won't stop until it changes, and it hasn't changed yet.
Okay, we're going to come back to all that in a bit more detail later on, but one final sort of introductory question, which is, does the Labour Party underestimate Boris Johnson? I mean, if you look at it, we've got fuel shortages, we've got food shortages, we've got inflation, we've got the threat of rising unemployment after the end of the furlough, and they're still ahead in the polls. I mean, he defies political gravity. What, does the Labour Party just not get this Prime Minister and how to oppose it?
Well, I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because obviously he does, in many ways, he's written his own rules over the years, hasn't he? And therefore the media treat him differently. But I would say to, the media need to maybe not do that, and not call one politician by their first name and everyone, I just think there's a bit of an issue there, I think, in terms of why does one politician get treated because everything's priced in and baked in and therefore you can get away with a lot more, and other politicians get hauled over the coals for all kinds of things. There's a bit of an imbalance there. But I think there's just a situation where an election was won, we went into a pandemic, opposition as normal hasn't been allowed, but it wasn't right at that time. So I think, I keep saying this, this conference in many ways is the sort of return of politics as normal. And that's why everything I'm saying is not intended to be, massive criticism of everybody. This is the moment, though, to say, right, okay, we are now taking this Prime Minister on, we are taking this government on, and here's how we'll do it. But I think the best way to take people on in this day and age is say what you would do. Honestly, I really believe that. I think the days of making sort of trenchant, stinging criticism from opposition with nothing else to point to, I think if it ever worked, it's definitely not going to work now.
So, coming to that, the question of what Labour should do. So take one thing that lots of people are talking about, which is, if you want to call it that, economic populism. Should Labour say, we're going to introduce taxes that disproportionately hit the rich?
I don't know if they would want to word it exactly like that.
No,
but
you can focus group the details, that's fine.
Absolutely. I think we need to start talking in terms of, we need to tax capital and wealth much more fairly than it is evading taxation largely. I've seen my good friends from the Labour land value tax. Are you in here? Any of? No, I don't know. But yeah, there's one. No, yeah, well done. That is an issue that people have plugged away on for years. They persuaded me back in 2010 that we should be taxing land very differently in this country. And that is an obvious area for the party to look. We should be looking at excessive wealth, excessive profits of individuals, taxing assets in a much more systematic way. Sort of not just going straight to taxing labour, but taxing capital is something that we should be talking seriously about. Absolutely. A top rate tax again of 50%, yes, I would support that again. So, but don't make it a sort of, a narrative that becomes about, just us and them and all of that. Just come up with a taxation system that is fair and everyone can say, okay, that's the way to do it. And this is why I was saying on social care, it clearly wasn't right to ask younger, low-paid people to pick up the bill for a cap on the assets of older people who might need social care. That clearly failed the basic fairness test. But it's why I was saying, what I proposed a number of years ago, a 10% levy on older people's estates, so that everyone is asked to contribute who's benefiting from the social care system, and that in some ways is a wealth tax, isn't it? Because the 10% will be far more valuable from some people than it would be from others. But it still allows people to protect the 90% of what they've worked for. So that is a tax policy that is progressive, but it's not about seen as like politics of envy and all the rest of it. So that's the kind of taxation approach I think the party needs to get into.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that strikes me that the government gets away with is talking about levelling up while doing things like ending the universal credit uplift. So we take practical steps which increase inequality while talking about levelling up. And do you think the Labour Party has been a bit too slow, or the Labour Party could be better at joining those two things up? After all, this is not just about geography, this is about people, it's about fairness.
I think you've touched on a really important point there. Levelling up has got to start with people. It doesn't start with railway lines or in whatever infrastructure you promise. That won't mean anything. Levelling up has got to start with people in their homes, in their workplaces, and go back to what I said at the very start. Why did parts of the north have that high case rate right the way through the pandemic? Because some large numbers of people there never stayed at home. They worked all the way through last year, and often they were in workplaces where there wasn't adequate security in terms of the workplace safety measures. And if they felt unwell or they were asked to isolate, they couldn't because they wouldn't be paid. People are living with high levels of insecurity, And that, I think, leads to the mental health pandemic that we've got. Because there are families who are just day to day wondering how they juggle it all and make it all add up. You know, Marcus Rashford came out and spoke directly to that issue last year. And my feeling is, if you're to respond properly to the pandemic, and you are genuinely to level up this country, you start, as you've correctly pointed to, you don't just increase universal credit a bit, you start thinking about a universal basic income. Because you cannot have health, your kids cannot have a good education if you don't have security over your income and over your home. And there's a huge number of people in this country now, not just in the north, all over the country, who do not have those two things. They do not have security over their income, and therefore they do not have security over their own home. They live in fear of eviction from their home. And you cannot level up the country on those kind of foundations. It will collapse whatever you build. And that's why I personally believe you have to start with, if it's not a universal basic income, something of that kind. And then secondly, I think we've got to talk a different language about housing, where housing becomes, good housing, secure housing, becomes a human right in UK law. You cannot leave this to the market anymore. The market does not give people housing security. You should follow Finland's lead, where housing first is a national philosophy. It basically says, if you guarantee all citizens a good home, a secure home, that is the foundation for a successful, prosperous society. And we've not been doing that in this country for a long, long time. The bottom third has had their sort of living standards chipped away at for years and years and years. And consequently, we pay huge amounts for failure through various ways as a country. So your question is bang on the money. Levelling up starts with people. And that's what Labour should definitely say that. And start to put those foundations beneath everybody. Good, secure homes, good, secure jobs, affordable public transport. That starts to level up.
But there's a potential tension, isn't there? I mean, if you use the language of levelling up to mean north versus south, that you forget the fact that there are people who face those real economic insecurities in the south as well. Isn't there a danger sometimes in talking about geography the way that you and others do, that we forget the fact that actually there are places in Cornwall, there are places in London, for heaven's sake, where there is abject poverty, and we shouldn't sort of lose them from view?
No, I touched on that earlier. I did acknowledge that. But I'm elected by the people of Greater Manchester. Okay. I mean, so I'm doing my job. And it's my job to speak up for a north of England that has been neglected by all governments for centuries. So I'm doing my job. And if people say that, I complained last week, I didn't complain, but I pointed out that 2 new tube stations were opening in London while we're patiently waiting for levelling up. And I got this, you get this back, if I say that, I get this backlash from London immediately.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, I don't know, I can understand why in some ways people say, don't have a go at London, it's not our fault. But the point of the matter is, we're waiting still for signs of levelling up. And I would say the gap's getting bigger. It's not getting narrower, it's getting bigger. And so it's my job to speak up for the North. And some people don't like that, but I'm afraid it's because the North has never really been able to kind of punch its weight in Whitehall. But we're beginning to do that. We've got a convention of the North coming in Liverpool next month, where all the mayors will be there, business leaders will be there. And we are getting more organised, definitely. And I think there's some people who don't like it. There's people in London who don't like the fact that we've got a louder voice. But that's my job. Other people can speak for other places where there's that poverty. And I absolutely accept, it's not a pure, this thing I'm talking about levelling up people, it would benefit all regions if we had policies of the kind that I'm talking about. And so there's a universal side of this, definitely, that would benefit people everywhere. But I'm not going to apologise for giving the North and Greater Manchester the strongest voice that I can give it, because the truth of the matter is we've been neglected for far too long. And if the powers that be are finding it difficult that we're going to challenge them properly, well, finally, I would say things are beginning to change, hopefully.
Now, I mean, credit where credit's due, politically speaking, levelling up is a fantastic phrase, isn't it? Because you sort of know what it means without knowing what it means, which is ideal, I suppose, if you're Prime Minister, in that you can't be... What can the Labour Party do to hold Boris Johnson to account when it comes to this issue of levelling up? There's a really, I mean, I imagine most people in this room don't subscribe to Conservative Home newsletters, but there is a piece in Conservative Home today that makes grim reading for the Labour Party, because the editor, Paul Goodman, is basically saying Boris Johnson could give the impression of levelling up without doing it by, you know, improving security in a few local parks, tarting up a couple of high streets. People will see that as progress, even if the fundamental structural issues remain unresolved and fundamental inequalities don't get touched. How do you go about combating that as an opposition party to make the point that, you know, the big issues are being ignored?
So I'm very much engaged on this now, and next week when the Conservatives come to Manchester, I will be putting on the table the proposal of a levelling up deal for Greater Manchester. And I'm saying, look, I'm going to define it for us. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm not going to wait forever for the government to define levelling up. This is what it, in this period, what, in terms of what's realistic in the rest of this Parliament, or in a 5-year period, this is realistic in terms of levelling up. At the heart of that is a London-style public transport system, and there's the critical bit, with London-level fares. Okay. Now, what I mean by that is an integrated system, in our case, over bus and tram. I have taken the decision to bring buses back under public control. And because of that, we are then in a position to control the system in the way that London controls the whole system. And we have bid for around £1 billion of capital. Mm-hmm. And that, in part, will pay for the electrification, large part of the bus system, which, for those who are interested in these things, won't be the old orange and white. Sorry to disappoint the Greater Manchester traditionalists in the room. It will be yellow and black, the B network. This is what is emerging. This is the vision that's emerging. And I know the £1 billion of capital pays for many things, but partly the electrification of that fleet. Our trams already run on renewable energy. And if you start to think about a transport system in Greater Manchester where the buses and the trams are one system, all running on renewable energy, it starts to get quite exciting, I would say. But the critical bit is London level fares, £1.55 a bus journey. If you only use buses in London for the whole day, you never go on the underground, there's a cap on it of £4.65. Did you know that? I didn't know that until last week. I was looking into it. You can take multiple buses for £4.65. That's the price of one bus journey in Greater Manchester. So that, to get to London level fares, we believe will require a revenue subsidy on top of the capital of around about, well, between 75 to 100 million pounds. So I'm going to be saying to the government, you back me, and you then hold me to account for delivering a London-style public transport system in Greater Manchester by 2024. So that, I think, takes this out of the kind of vague argument about what is levelling up. You know, I'm going to put that proposal on the table, you know, and I'm not doing it with any politics. I'm just saying, you want levelling up, we want levelling up, we think this is levelling up, please back us, and then we can move this into a sort of delivery phase.
But you're not naive, are you? I mean, the fact that you're going to propose it makes it less likely that they're going to accept it because you've proposed it. I mean,
no, I think the politics works as well, if I'm honest with you, because, as I said, they can hold me to account. Okay, so if that doesn't work in the way, they can start saying that mayor is always shouting off and blah blah blah, and look, you know, we gave him the money to level up, he hasn't. You know, blame. If it really comes off, they can use their bigger megaphone than the one I've got, say, we paid for this, and you know, we made this happen, we said we'd level up, and it has happened. And the point is, imagine our yellow and black public transport system, you know, the B network, all in place. That would be a very visible, tangible sign of levelling up at the heart of the north of England that they could point to come the next general election. Oh, that won't make me very happy that they would do that, but they could do that. So the politics of what I'm saying does actually work for them as well.
Okay. There are two schools of thought when it comes to cities. I mean, the one is if you make prosperous cities, you make a prosperous country. The other is if you focus all your energy and your attention on cities, what you end up with is, at best, dormitory towns that lose their own soul and their life and their sort of existence as commercial centres because all of the economic energy gets sucked into cities. I mean, it's true to say, isn't it, that you belong to the first camp rather than the second if you delineate them like that? I
just think it's a really dangerous thing to say, are you in favour of towns or are you in favour of cities? I think, I really wish, that's a kind of simplistic narrative of the kind we've seen a lot in politics in recent times. You're kind of taking it right down to a very basic, and then it's trying to divide people. Which one are you in favour of? I think we can begin to show that it's both, basically. If you link 2.8 million people in the transport system that I've been describing, town and city will benefit together. And just to give you evidence behind what I'm saying, have a look at what's going on in Stockport at the moment. Mm-hmm. So Stockport has the first mayoral development corporation in the country that's focused on a town centre. Mm-hmm. And Stockport has, I think, it's a fantastic vision, which is around 3,500 homes, many of them zero carbon, linked to a new transport interchange, which we're building, which will be Metrolink capable, so tram capable. And the way the leader of Stockport Council describes it is that Stockport is becoming Brooklyn to Manchester's New York. So nobody laughed. Everyone went, okay, well, we're buying that, yeah. But I think it's a great description. But
everyone's horrified.
What they're saying, Stockport, is city centre style living in Stockport, and you're 10 minutes on the West Coast Main Line from the city centre. And there's nothing wrong with that, because already you can see it. Stockport has independent coffee shops, bars, record shops. There's a new sort of economy is emerging in Stockport town centre. And I think that's this idea that dormitory towns, I think we need to sort of move away from that language. This is going to be a great place to live. There's going to be a huge green space on the top of this new transport interchange that we're building. Chris Boardman is putting in the most fantastic cycling and walking infrastructure. That, I think, is how town and city rise together. And we're now looking to take this idea to the north of Greater Manchester, to Middleton, to start showing how levelling up can really mean something in places on the ground.
But I have to say, if you said that to people in the place where I grew up, which is, the sort of a Yorkshire equivalent, so it's Wakefield, so the big city is Leeds, they'd be incredibly resentful. It shouldn't be like, you can live in Wakefield and work in Leeds. The question will be, why can't you have jobs in Wakefield? Because otherwise, Wakefield just becomes a massive housing estate for the middle class who work in Leeds, and everyone else gets forgotten.
Because life has changed, and I would say I was going to say something about Yorkshire there. I won't. I'll hold myself there. I'm making enough headlines. I probably won't make another one there. I think I was going to make something about negativity and Yorkshire sometimes going together a little, but I won't go.
That's just me, I think.
That's just you. So life has changed, hasn't it? In terms of Wakefield or Lee that I used to represent, where people live there and they walk to work, and that isn't what life is going to be like. What you're going to see instead now is clusters of take Media City in Greater Manchester. You get sort of places where there'll be a kind of concentration of jobs in some of these new industries, or obviously in the city centre or the airport in our case. And you're going to have to support people with, back to this issue of transport, affordable ways. If you're Oldham at the moment, if you want to work at Media City or the airport, if you're a young person from Oldham, it will cost you a fortune to get there and back every day, and it's not particularly easy because the transport's not integrated. But you start to change that, then it becomes, that's a doable prospect. And the idea is then that the towns like Stockport are being somehow left behind by that. But no, the retail can be turned into residential, more attractive. You can bring people back living in the town centre. I think it's a much better vision than sort of bringing back industries that used to sort of pollute the air and God knows what. So I think Greater Manchester probably has a stronger identity where it's less, if I can put it this way, they get everything in Manchester and we get nothing in Rochdale, or we get nothing in. There's a little bit of that, but I think there's a growing sense of the Greater Manchester identity, and we're all beginning to benefit together. And that's the way to look at it. And I'm sure Tracy will build that spirit in West Yorkshire. That was a positive thing there.
As long as she makes her headquarters Wakefield and not Leeds. You've spoken about metro mayors being the path to power for Labour. What do you mean by that?
It allows a different way of doing politics, a completely different way. So the thing about this kind of role that I have and that Steve and Tracy have is that you can kind of build from the bottom up. And there's another important difference between our role and the role of an MP, or anyone involved in national politics. We are starting from a place-first perspective. Place first. You've got to go there. I know people voted for me who normally would vote for the Liberal Democrats, the Greens or the Tories. I know that. And therefore it's my job I've got to start for the place, really. And this is why I describe myself as a little more independent because of that. I am a Labour mayor, proudly, a Labour and cooperative mayor. But first and foremost, I've got to be the mayor of Greater Manchester. And everyone has got to feel able to buy into what we're doing, whoever they vote for. And there's a really important point here about why English devolution offers a route to reconnection for all political parties, actually, but particularly ours. If you start from that premise, if that's your starting point, rather than the party-first thing of Westminster with the benches and the point scoring and all the rest of it, it's just you've got the conditions for a much more unifying form of politics, a more engaging form of politics, because people care about the place where they live, whoever they vote for. And if you're kind of basically starting with the common ground, aren't you? And people are able then to buy in. And what we've done is we've really opened things up. We've tried to use devolution to say, right, everybody can get involved here in shaping what we're trying to do. The best example I can give you, 2 examples quickly. Homelessness was is a massive issue for us, and I think it's on the increase again post-pandemic. The everyone in thing seems to have been a little blip, and we've got big challenges again. When I got elected, I said we want to end rough sleeping in Greater Manchester, and I stand by that. We created a homelessness action network that brought together public, private, voluntary, community, faith, people who've been doing great work but a bit in isolation, all starting to pull in the same direction. And it's a joy to work with everybody, to be honest. And we've got this kind of bottom-up drive that engages people. And policy is made through that homelessness action network. The flagship scheme, A Bed Every Night, that we've created, which looks after over 600 people every night. Last night, 600 people in A Bed Every Night that just didn't exist a few years ago. That idea came from the faith sector, from one of our faith leaders in the city. And so it's like you take other people's ideas and you can make them happen quickly. And that is a really that's energizing for people. Yeah. Or take the free bus pass that I introduced for 16 to 18-year-olds. Our Youth Combined Authority designed it, built it. They did it. I'm not just creating them to pat them on the head. I said, no, you create this R-Pass. You turn it into what you want. And that I would just put to you is that opens politics up in a much more positive way. And I think it explains why the results were good for us, because people feel engaged with what's going on in the city region. We've created a race equality panel. We've created a women and girls panel. We're bringing all voices into Greater Manchester devolution. And I just hope that explains, because it's a really important question. And I just wanted the opportunity to explain it. It's a different way of doing politics. I need to say this clearly to the Labour Party. Get on board with it, use it, people connect with it, and then the reconnection comes back to the Labour Party in the long run. But the connection comes not by just saying Labour's great, and hoping people will start to believe you. It comes from doing rather than saying, if I could put it that way. Deeds, not words, as the famous suffragettes from our city said. A bit more, if you buy into devolution, you can start doing deeds, not words, and it makes politics more meaningful for people. And I think it gets some positivity back into it.
I've got 2 or 3 follow-ups to that. The first is, I get the impression that being an MP is a very different job now to what it was 20 years ago, and MPs act more like mayors of their town than they used to. There's a stronger local focus for this new generation of MPs than there was, say, 10 or 15 years ago. They're more grounded in their constituencies. They spend more time in their constituencies. They talk about their constituencies a lot more than they used to when it was all about the national game. Would you say that's fair? Do you get that same impression?
I think so. The danger is, though, MPs become sort of super councillors or something. And I know some of the newly elected Conservative MPs. They are just playing the Facebook game. There's a controversy in a certain part of the constituency. Right, I'm there and I'm going, and then there's another one up. And I can see that happening. And I think that's almost taking politics down a level. And MPs are not, I don't think, often operating at the level they should be operating at. They've kind of gone hyper-local. And that is a problem, because they're then kind of cutting across councillors, they're cutting across, you know, but I definitely observe that has happened. And all I can say is, if I look like I'm enjoying this job, it's because I feel liberated from some of that system. You know, when you've got an MP that's just looking after 70,000 people in quite a small area, that's going to create that kind of parochialism, isn't it? And particularly in the sort of Facebook age, it's going to mean people are leaping on the hyper-local. I've come round to proportional representation for a number of reasons, but one, I believe the Commons would function better in the national interest if MPs were looking more up for the region as opposed to a tiny sort of constituency, and also freed from the whip, actually, to be able to advocate for that region and use leverage for that region, working, you know. So we've got a good example is the HS2 bill is coming to the Commons quite soon, and it's going to be bad news for Greater Manchester, and I think it's going to be terrible news for West Yorkshire. I think I'm only from the rumours I'm hearing. We're going to get, you know, a station that just, we think we need an underground station. They're going to build out on the level because it's cheaper, and they're going to take all of our development land around Piccadilly. West Yorkshire, we're hearing it's going to be chopped all together. I believe Northern MPs should be, when that bill comes to Parliament, should be free to work across party political lines to get the right deal for the north of England. But the whip system sort of operates against that, because it just says, no, you've got to vote with what we're... And that's what I'm saying. I think the Commons you would be creating a Commons that can actually level up if you had MPs in there who are empowered to be a bit more independent advocates for the region, rather than the system that we've currently got. And I do think you've touched on a really important issue there. I
mean, which raised quite an interesting question. Would you say there's more that unites you with Andy Street than divides you from him? I
don't know if I'd put it like that. I mean, because he's a Tory, so...
Yeah. Well, given what you just said, I mean, you know...
I would say we've got a lot...
concerns are similar to yours.
If you start with place first, and you go more from a more pragmatic perspective, you find you start agreeing on... You identify what you can agree on, rather than looking, as national politicians do, how can I disagree with this person? Yeah. And that's the starting point, isn't it? For where can I score my point off this person who's, you know, alongside me? Whereas we try and find common ground, and then we say, well, okay, where we agree. So on skills, for instance, we both strongly agree it should be devolved, and we make that case jointly to the government. Yeah, there's a lot I would agree with him on, but there's a lot I would disagree with him on. And I think the thing about mature politics is being honest about both of those things, isn't it? Where do we agree? Well, let's work together. Where we don't, well, that's the choice at the election for the public. So buses, for instance, I firmly believe buses should be under public control. Andy Street doesn't. But that is a genuine issue then that the voters can have a say on at the election.
What do you make of the changes that have taken place in Whitehall around Michael Gove's new department? Do you sort of think, oh wow, they're taking this seriously now, or do you think they're sort of rearranging the deck chairs?
It's always like a bit of a... Sorry, I hope it was... nothing I said was that. No. It's always a bit of a thick of it type moment when you've put the name of your sort of political initiative into the title of a government department. It's always a bit of a moment like that, isn't it? It's not, oh well, we've not really got any ideas on levelling up, so let's call the government department. There's a bit of that about it. Anyway, but let me be a bit more serious. I think, to be honest, I think Gove is good news for the levelling up agenda. I do. I'm not going to make a pointless criticism here. I was his shadow when he was Education Secretary. Honestly, we clashed over pretty much all of that agenda that he brought in 2011. But the thing about Michael Gove is, at least he does things. He brings energy to what he does. And you may disagree with him, but he acts as a minister, and he creates an agenda, and he then implements it. And I've observed in this current government so many who just aren't doing that. They're just minding the shop or something. But Gove doesn't do that. He really, goes at things. And I think levelling up, regeneration, is less contestable territory, let me put it that way, than education. So I hope, when I put this levelling up deal to him, I'm hoping that he will embrace it and see what we're trying to do. And if we can agree on it, that would be great, wouldn't it, for everybody, if we can agree on it. The only trouble is, he's a Queen's Park Rangers supporter, and they knocked Everton out on penalties last week. So there's a little, he's been giving me a bit, anyway, so there we go. There's lots of reasons for Michael and I not to see eye to eye, but I've got more of a hope that levelling up is going to move in a positive direction now he's in position, if I can put it that way.
And institutionally, I mean, both in terms of national government and in terms of the Labour Party, what could and should be done to give mayors like you a greater voice or a greater say? Because you're frequently complaining that you're left out of the loop, you're not included in decision making. What can be done to make that work? It can't just be a matter of personal whim. Are there institutional ways of doing this?
I mean, personally, there is so much of existing spending that would be spent better if it was decentralised and put under our control. And I'll give you an example. We've got an element of DWP, devolution. Yeah. It's essentially the work programme. And credit to DWP, because they've been prepared to try something different. So in effect, it's the sort of going away from the tick box, I, Daniel Blake, computer says no thing, of, just that kind of thing. And what they've said to us is, can you come up with a different way of helping people longest out of the labour market back into work? And we have. Because it's much more about personalised support, mental health support, and our success rate is double what the work programme achieved nationally. So I would say, go from that. I would devolve actually large parts of the DWP budget. And I think, for instance, take housing benefit. So much money just gets given to landlords who don't invest in the upkeep of their properties. If we just shovel public money to unscrupulous landlords who just rake that in and don't put any of it back into the upkeep of their properties. Now, if we had control of the housing benefit budget, we would bring it in alongside a good landlord charter, and you would not be able, unless your home met the decent home standard, you wouldn't be able to access that. And that, we would drive things, you see the point I'm making? So I would put existing spending as far as possible, skills spending under our control, and then hold us to account for how we're using it by all means. But in the long run, I think you've got to move to the ability to raise more tax. A tourist tax. Most European cities have them. Why don't English cities have them? And I think you would open up fiscal devolution, not immediately, but on this journey. I'm one of the few that raises a precept. And I think the Greater Manchester public will be prepared to go with you if you're honest with them about what the money is going to be used for. So, public spending under control, local control, and in the long run, work towards proper fiscal devolution, with borrowing powers as well.
I was just getting settled in then. I got loads more questions here. I've just been told we're running out of time. Do you think Labour can win the next election?
Yes.
And what if I said to you, OK, give the leader 3 tips to do that?
Well, I did in a Guardian article not so long ago. And I just want to be, I support Keir. I support what they're trying to do. But
it wasn't an accusation.
No. But I am, I don't want to sound grand here, but, I am a former Labour cabinet minister. And I've kind of been through the agonies of that and coming into opposition. So I hope when I say things, people should see that I'm saying it for a reason. I'm not saying it just to create I'm trying to help. But so I answered your question straight off the bat, yes. But I think it's also it's dangerous times for the Labour Party as well. There's a volatility out there. There's a moment to be captured here. But if we don't, there's a lot of people who are waiting to see where they're going to go, and they might go somewhere else, genuinely. And so I don't think we've got any time, really. I think it is now. We've been through a pandemic. People are hurt. People are damaged. Communities are really struggling as a result. And everyone needs lifting. And they're waiting for who's going to lift us is what they're asking. Where are we going to come back to? How are we going to be levelled up? Who's going to do that? Who's giving us hope? And I think who's giving us hope. That Labour needs to sort of think, it's got to be us. Got to be us. Just as we rebuilt Britain after the war, we've got to rebuild Britain after the pandemic. I think this is a moment to do it. But you can't hold your cards back and think, oh, we'll play it cautiously. You've got to, I think, now recognise that the country is waiting for an alternative, and it needs to be set out.
But, I mean, beyond channeling Barack Obama, what are a couple of practical things the party could and should do?
Well, I mentioned social care.
Yeah.
Because that's an issue. The government's put it on the table. What I keep coming back to it is, I don't know, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I feel like, you know, sometimes I've been on this, stuck record on this, but does a national care service, does that work for people broadly or not? A few nods there. But yes. Let's put it a different way. Social care on NHS terms. Can I do a bit of audience participation?
Do what you want.
Given that there are tax implications to it, that may be difficult, you have to, but just a quick show of hands, who would support the party committing to social care on NHS terms, free at the point of use? Okay, does anybody not support it? Okay, well there you go. I mean, so, okay, that's it, that's us, and that's in this room. But that is a policy. The country knows that care in the NHS works when it's free at the point of use, and you don't have to worry about it, and you don't have to pay out your mum and dad's bank account to pay for it. They like that. So why are they not going to like it for social care? And I just think that's the level that you've got to just get in there with. You don't have to do all the details straight away. Just commit to what we're going to do and what we're going to stand for, and then the public will hear that and they'll respond to it. Brilliant. I think.
I'm now obsessed with figuring out whether the person opposed to the national social care was the same person who you were praising for the land value thing.
I think that
very much the same sort of part.
Oh my God, that is. I think a land value tax could pay for free social care.
But anyway, listen.
Right, God, there's big debates we had there. I'm going to find you. And
we have run out of time, I'm afraid. Andy Burnham, thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening.
Stop that.